Have you ever noticed how easily people get emotionally triggered today? How a single comment can ruin someone's entire day? How a short video can fill thousands of people with rage, fear, or moral certainty within seconds? People react instantly. They defend positions passionately. They argue with strangers online as if their lives depend on it. Yet if you ask them why they feel so strongly, why they are so certain, the answers quickly become vague. They say things like, "It just feels wrong," or "Everyone knows this," or "It's obvious." But obvious to who? Because what we are witnessing today is not emotional intelligence. It is emotional conditioning. And the uncomfortable truth is that we are living through the creation of the most emotionally manipulated generation in human history. Not because people are naturally weaker, not because people are less capable of thinking, but because modern society has built systems designed to influence human emotion on a massive scale. Fear spreads faster than truth, outrage spreads faster than reason, and validation spreads faster than wisdom. And once emotions are controlled, everything else becomes easy to influence. For most of human history, controlling a population required physical power. Kings relied on armies, empires relied on violence, rulers relied on censorship and force. But over time, something far more effective was discovered. You do not need to control people's actions if you can control their emotions, because emotions dictate behavior. If you can make people angry, they will attack. If you make them afraid, they will obey. If you make them feel morally superior, they will defend whatever system gives them that feeling. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this principle centuries ago, when he observed that people do not respond to truth itself. They respond to how truth is presented to them emotionally. People react not to reality, but to their interpretation of reality. And once you understand this, the most powerful weapon is not information, it is emotional influence. Look closely at modern media, and you will see this principle everywhere. News headlines are rarely written to inform, they are written to provoke. They are designed to spark anger, fear, or outrage before you even read the article. Social media amplifies posts that trigger the strongest emotional reactions because those reactions create engagement. Calm analysis does not spread, but outrage spreads instantly. Thoughtful discussion moves slowly, but emotional conflict spreads like wildfire. The systems that dominate modern communication have learned a simple rule about human psychology. Emotional people stay engaged, thinking people log off. So the system rewards emotional intensity and quietly discourages calm reflection. But this emotional engineering did not happen overnight. It developed slowly, as institutions realized something fundamental about human nature. Human beings are not purely rational creatures. We like to believe we make decisions logically, that our beliefs are based on careful thought, that our opinions come from evidence and reason. But the reality is far more complicated. Most of our decisions begin emotionally, and only afterward do we invent logical explanations to justify them. Psychologists have repeatedly observed that the human brain reacts emotionally to information first, and only later attempts to rationalize that reaction, which means if someone can control the emotional response, the intellectual conclusion often follows automatically. This insight transformed how information is delivered in the modern world. Instead of presenting facts first and allowing people to interpret them calmly, modern communication begins with emotion. A shocking headline, an alarming statistic, a dramatic image, a story designed to trigger anger or fear. Once the emotional reaction occurs, the mind becomes far more receptive to the message that follows. When people feel threatened, they become more obedient. When people feel morally outraged, they become more tribal. When people feel validated by their group, they become more confident in beliefs they have not carefully examined. Over time, this creates a culture where emotional intensity replaces thoughtful understanding. People begin to measure the importance of an issue not by how well they understand it, but by how strongly they feel about it. The louder the emotion, the more certain they become that they are right. Calm reflection begins to look like indifference, and hesitation begins to look like weakness. In this environment, the person who pauses to think carefully before reacting is often ignored, while the person who expresses the strongest emotion receives the most attention. Technology then discovered something even more powerful: the brain's reward system. Every notification, every like, Every comment triggers a small release of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is the same chemical associated with addiction, anticipation, and reward. This creates a subtle psychological loop. You express an emotional reaction. People respond. Your brain receives a reward. Over time, your mind learns something without you realizing it. Emotional expression brings validation. The more dramatic the emotion, the stronger the reaction you receive from others. Anger gets attention. Outrage gets attention. Best sympathy. And tribal loyalty gets approval. Slowly, without realizing it, people begin to perform emotions rather than experience them naturally. They learn which reactions receive approval and which reactions are ignored. They begin expressing outrage not only because they feel it, but because they know it will be rewarded. They express certainty because uncertainty rarely receives attention. They defend positions passionately because passion attracts engagement. The line between genuine emotion and social performance begins to blur. Carl Jung warned about this phenomenon long before the internet existed. He observed that when people fail to understand their own emotions, those emotions begin to possess them. Instead of guiding their feelings consciously, they become controlled by them. Jung described this as unconscious possession, a state where a person believes they are acting rationally while in reality they are being driven by forces they do not understand. In this state, emotions do not simply influence decisions, they dominate them. Anger feels like truth, fear feels like wisdom, and moral outrage feels like justice. When millions of people experience this simultaneously, society becomes extremely volatile. Conversations become battles of emotion rather than exchanges of ideas. People no longer ask whether something is true. They ask whether it feels right according to their group's emotional expectations. Disagreement becomes threatening because it disrupts the emotional harmony of the group. Anyone who questions the emotional narrative risks being labeled disloyal or insensitive. And once emotional conformity becomes the norm, independent thinking becomes increasingly rare. People begin to mirror the emotional reactions of those around them. If the group is angry, individuals become angry. If the group is outraged, individuals become outraged. Emotional contagion spreads quickly through social networks, reinforcing the same reactions again and again. Over time, entire communities begin responding to information in almost identical ways, as if they are sharing a single emotional script. This is how emotional manipulation quietly becomes a cultural norm. No single person is consciously controlling every reaction. Instead, systems are designed in ways that reward emotional intensity and discourage careful reflection. The individuals participating in the system often believe they are acting freely, expressing their authentic feelings, defending their deeply held beliefs. Yet those emotions have been subtly shaped by an environment that constantly rewards certain reactions while ignoring others. And the more this cycle continues, the more difficult it becomes to notice what is happening. Because when emotional conditioning becomes normal, it stops feeling like manipulation. It begins to feel like reality itself. Once emotions become the primary driver of public conversation, another transformation quietly begins to take place. People start confusing emotional intensity with moral truth. The stronger the feeling, the more convinced they become that their position must be correct. If something makes them angry, they assume it must be unjust. If something makes them uncomfortable, they assume it must be wrong. And if something makes them feel proud or validated, they assume it must be good. But emotions are not designed to determine truth. Emotions evolved to help human beings survive immediate threats, not to evaluate complex ideas, political systems, or philosophical arguments. When emotions become the primary tool for interpreting reality, understanding becomes shallow and easily manipulated. Friedrich Nietzsche observed this danger more than a century ago. He noticed that people often hide their desire for power behind moral language. Instead of saying, "I want this because it benefits me," they say, "This is morally right, and anyone who disagrees is immoral." Nietzsche called this the psychology of the herd. In the herd, individuals do not evaluate ideas independently. They adopt the emotional reactions that dominate their group. Agreement becomes virtue. Disagreement becomes betrayal. Once a person attaches their emotional identity to a belief, defending that belief becomes psychologically necessary. Even when evidence appears that challenges their position, the emotional attachment remains stronger than the intellectual argument. This is why modern discussions often feel impossible to resolve. Two people are not simply debating ideas, they are defending emotional identities. One side feels morally righteous, the other side feels morally righteous as well. Each group interprets disagreement as an attack on their character, rather than a challenge to their reasoning. The moment this happens, rational dialogue becomes extremely difficult, because if someone's identity is built around a belief, changing that belief feels like losing a part of themselves. Social media amplifies this psychological pattern dramatically. Platforms are designed to reward content that provokes strong emotional reactions. Calm explanations rarely travel far across the internet, but outrage travels instantly. The algorithm does not measure truth or wisdom, it measures engagement. Engagement increases when people feel something intense: anger, fear, excitement, moral superiority. As a result, the system naturally promotes content that triggers these emotions. Over time, people begin to see a distorted version of reality, one where every issue appears urgent, every disagreement appears catastrophic, and every opposing viewpoint appears dangerous. This constant exposure to emotional stimulation gradually reshapes how people interpret the world. Instead of carefully evaluating information, they develop emotional shortcuts. A certain phrase triggers anger, another phrase triggers pride, another phrase triggers fear. The reaction happens instantly, often before the person has fully processed the content itself. Psychologists call this emotional priming. When the brain learns to associate certain words or images with specific emotional reactions, those reactions occur automatically. The person believes they are making a thoughtful judgment, but in reality the emotional response has already determined their conclusion. Sigmund Freud believed that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious forces that operate beneath the surface of awareness. Desires, fears, and emotional associations influence decisions long before conscious reasoning enters the picture. When people believe they are purely rational, they become especially vulnerable to manipulation because they stop questioning their own emotional impulses. If a piece of information makes them angry, they assume the anger must be justified. If it makes them feel validated, they assume it must be correct. The emotional response becomes the evidence. This creates a powerful illusion of understanding. People feel deeply informed because they feel deeply emotional about certain topics. They can discuss these issues passionately. They can argue intensely. They can repeat phrases and slogans that express their position. But if you ask them to explain the issue step by step, to describe the opposing argument fairly, or to analyze the deeper complexity of the situation, the conversation often collapses. The emotional reaction remains strong, but the intellectual foundation behind it is surprisingly weak. Arthur Schopenhauer once remarked that many people mistake the repetition of ideas for understanding them. A person may memorize arguments, repeat popular opinions, and quote statements they have heard many times, yet still lack genuine comprehension of the issue itself. In the modern environment, this phenomenon has become extremely common. Information spreads rapidly through short posts, short videos, and simplified headlines. People absorb fragments of arguments without ever encountering the full context. These fragments combine with emotional reactions to create a powerful sense of certainty, and certainty is extremely attractive to the human mind. Uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Doubt requires effort. Admitting that a complex issue may not have an easy answer can feel frustrating. Emotional certainty, on the other hand, feels satisfying. It provides clarity, direction, and belonging. When someone expresses strong confidence in their beliefs, others often interpret that confidence as intelligence. In reality, confidence and understanding are not the same thing. Some of the most confident individuals are the least informed, because their emotional commitment prevents them from questioning their assumptions. Once this emotional certainty spreads through a group, it becomes self-reinforcing. Members of the group validate each other's reactions, repeat the same emotional narratives, and discourage dissenting voices. Anyone who asks too many questions risks being viewed as disloyal or insensitive. As a result, people gradually learn to align their emotions with the expectations of the group. They express outrage when the group expresses outrage. They celebrate when the group celebrates. and they remain silent when the group discourages discussion. Over time, this process creates a powerful emotional environment where certain reactions become almost automatic. Individuals who spend enough time inside that environment begin to internalize the emotional patterns around them. What once felt like social pressure slowly becomes personal belief. The person genuinely feels the anger, the pride, or the fear that the group encourages. Yet those emotions did not emerge independently. They were cultivated through repeated exposure to the same emotional cues. This is how emotional manipulation becomes extremely effective without appearing manipulative. No one needs to force people to feel a certain way. The environment simply rewards certain emotions and discourages others. Over time, individuals adapt to that environment, just as people naturally adapt to the climate around them. Emotional responses that align with the system receive attention and approval, while calmer or more skeptical reactions receive little reinforcement. Gradually, a subtle transformation occurs in the human mind. Instead of using emotions as signals that require reflection, people begin using emotions as instructions for action. Anger becomes a command to attack. Fear becomes a command to retreat. Pride becomes a command to defend the group. The pause between emotion and action begins to disappear. Reaction replaces reflection. And once reaction becomes automatic, emotional manipulation becomes incredibly efficient because the system no longer needs to persuade people through careful reasoning. It only needs to trigger the right emotion at the right moment. As emotional reactions become faster and more automatic, another subtle change begins to occur inside the human mind. People slowly lose the ability to distinguish between feeling something strongly and understanding it deeply. The two experiences begin to blur together. If an idea produces a powerful emotional response, it feels convincing, even if the person has never examined the logic behind it. And when millions of people operate this way simultaneously, entire societies begin reacting emotionally before thinking carefully. This is not entirely new. Human beings have always been influenced by emotion. But what is new is the speed and scale at which emotional signals now travel. A rumor that once took weeks to spread across a country can now reach millions of people in minutes. A single emotional video can shape public opinion faster than an entire book of careful reasoning. Information has accelerated, but human psychology has not evolved to process information at that speed. The emotional brain reacts immediately, while the rational brain requires time to analyze. Neuroscientists often describe this as the difference between fast thinking and slow thinking. Fast thinking is automatic, emotional, and reactive. It evolved to help our ancestors survive immediate danger. When a person hears a sudden noise in the forest, fast thinking triggers fear before the mind has time to analyze the situation. Slow thinking, on the other hand, is deliberate and analytical. It requires patience and attention. It allows a person to examine evidence, consider multiple perspectives, and reach thoughtful conclusions. Modern systems are optimized for fast thinking. The design of social media, news cycles, and digital communication rewards speed and immediacy. Posts that provoke instant reactions rise to the top of the feed, while content that requires careful reading is often ignored. As a result, people spend more and more time operating in fast emotional mode and less time practicing slow reflective thought. The mind becomes trained to react instantly rather than analyze patiently. Carl Jung believed that when individuals fail to examine their inner reactions consciously, those reactions begin to dominate their personality. He called this the problem of the unconscious. The unconscious mind contains hidden fears, unresolved frustrations, and emotional impulses that influence behavior without the person realizing it. When these forces remain unexplored, they often project themselves onto the outside world. A person may accuse others of the very traits they secretly fear in themselves. They may interpret disagreement as hostility because their own emotions are already tense and defensive. In a highly emotional society, this psychological projection becomes extremely common. People begin seeing enemies everywhere, interpreting ordinary disagreement as moral attack. Because their emotions are already activated, they assume that anyone who disagrees must be acting with bad intentions. Nuance disappears. Complexity becomes suspicious. The world divides into simple categories of allies and enemies, right and wrong, good and evil. This simplification feels satisfying because it reduces uncertainty. Complex issues require patience and humility to understand. Emotional narratives offer something easier, a clear villain, a clear hero, and a clear emotional reaction. Stories like this spread quickly because they require very little effort to process, but the simplicity often hides the deeper reality. Most social and political issues are far more complicated than the emotional narratives that dominate public discussion. Over time, people become accustomed to this simplified emotional worldview. They begin interpreting every new event through the same emotional lens. If something happens that supports their existing beliefs, they accept it immediately. If something contradicts their beliefs, they dismiss it without investigation. The emotional narrative becomes stronger than the evidence itself. Philosophers throughout history have warned about this danger. The Stoic thinkers of ancient Greece and Rome believed that emotional impulses should always be examined before being trusted. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that impressions are not the same as truth. Just because something appears frightening or offensive does not mean it truly is. The mind must step back, examine the impression carefully, and ask whether the reaction is justified. But this kind of mental discipline requires practice. It requires silence, reflection, and patience. In a world filled with constant stimulation, those qualities become increasingly rare. People are surrounded by endless streams of information competing for their attention. Notifications interrupt moments of quiet thought. Headlines demand instant reactions. Conversations shift rapidly from one emotional topic to the next. As a result, the mind rarely has the opportunity to slow down and process experiences deeply. Emotional reactions accumulate throughout the day without being examined or resolved. Anger from one story blends with frustration from another. Fear from one headline blends with outrage from another. The emotional atmosphere becomes constantly charged. This environment has a powerful psychological effect. When people are repeatedly exposed to emotional stimuli, their threshold for reaction becomes lower. Small disagreements begin to feel like major conflicts. Minor frustrations feel like serious threats. The nervous system remains in a state of constant alertness, scanning the environment for the next emotional trigger. In this state, calm reasoning becomes difficult. The brain prioritizes emotional responses over analytical thought. People feel compelled to respond quickly, to defend their identity, to protect their group. The pause that once existed between stimulus and response gradually disappears. Friedrich Nietzsche observed a similar phenomenon when he studied the psychology of crowds. He noticed that individuals often behave differently when they are surrounded by others who share the same emotional reaction. In a crowd, emotions intensify, anger becomes louder, excitement becomes more contagious, and caution becomes weaker. Individuals who might normally behave calmly begin adopting the emotional tone of the group. Modern digital communities function in a similar way. Thousands of people can gather around a single emotional narrative, reinforcing each other's reactions. Each comment adds fuel to the emotional fire. Each expression of outrage encourages others to express even stronger outrage. The emotional atmosphere grows thicker and more intense with every interaction. Eventually, the emotional momentum becomes self-sustaining. People no longer need a new event to provoke a reaction. The group itself maintains the emotional energy. Members continue repeating the same arguments, the same accusations, the same narratives, long after the original issue is faded. The emotional identity of the group becomes more important than the issue that originally created it. In this environment, independent thinking becomes uncomfortable. Asking calm questions may be interpreted as disloyalty. Expressing uncertainty may be seen as weakness. Individuals learn quickly which emotional reactions are acceptable and which ones will lead to criticism or exclusion. To avoid conflict, many people begin adjusting their reactions to match the group. At first, this adjustment may feel superficial, a simple social adaptation, but over time, repeated behavior shapes genuine belief. A person who repeatedly expresses the same emotional reactions begins to internalize them. What began as social conformity slowly becomes personal conviction. This is how emotional environments shape entire generations. People grow up surrounded by the same emotional patterns, the same narratives, the same reactions. Those patterns begin to feel normal, even inevitable. The idea that one could step outside the emotional cycle and observe it calmly becomes increasingly unfamiliar. Yet the human mind still retains the capacity for awareness. Beneath the noise of constant reaction lies the possibility of reflection. When a person pauses long enough to examine their own emotions, they may begin to notice patterns that once felt invisible. They may begin asking questions that rarely appear in emotionally charged conversations. Why did this headline make me angry so quickly? Why did this story trigger fear before I understood the facts? Why do certain topics always provoke the same emotional response? These questions mark the beginning of a different kind of awareness. Instead of being carried along by emotional currents, the individual begins observing those currents from a distance. The emotions are still present, but they are no longer invisible forces directing behavior. They become signals that can be examined and understood. And once a person reaches that point, the entire emotional landscape of modern society begins to look very different. When a person begins to observe their own emotional reactions carefully, something remarkable starts to happen. The emotional world that once felt overwhelming begins to slow down. Reactions that once felt automatic begin to reveal their patterns. A headline that once triggered instant anger now produces curiosity instead. A comment that once felt like a personal attack now appears as another person's perspective. The pause between stimulus and response slowly returns. This pause is more powerful than most people realize. For thousands of years, philosophers have described this moment as the birthplace of wisdom. It is the moment when a human being recognizes that emotions are signals, not commands. The feeling of anger does not require immediate action. The feeling of fear does not require instant obedience. The feeling of pride does not guarantee truth. Each emotion becomes something to examine rather than something to obey. The Stoic philosophers considered this ability the foundation of inner freedom. Epictetus taught that external events do not control the human mind, only our interpretations of those events do. If someone insults you, the insult itself does not harm you unless you decide that it does. If a rumor spreads online, it does not control your emotions, unless you accept the emotional interpretation attached to it. According to the Stoics, the power of the mind lies in choosing how to interpret what happens. In a world built around emotional manipulation, this ability becomes incredibly rare. Systems designed to provoke reaction depend on speed. They rely on people responding instantly, sharing quickly, arguing immediately. The moment people begin pausing before reacting, the emotional machinery slows down. A person who refuses to respond instantly becomes difficult to influence. This is why calm individuals often appear unusual in modern conversations. When others around them react with outrage or fear, they respond with quiet observation. Instead of repeating emotional narratives, they ask questions. Instead of defending a tribe automatically, they examine the arguments carefully. Their calmness can even make others uncomfortable because it interrupts the emotional rhythm that everyone else has accepted. Friedrich Nietzsche once suggested that the greatest challenge for any independent thinker is learning how to stand apart from the emotional momentum of the crowd. Crowds move quickly, emotionally, and with great certainty. Individuals who slow down, who question the emotional narrative, often feel isolated at first. But Nietzsche believed that this independence is essential for genuine understanding. Truth rarely appears in the loudest emotional reaction. It emerges slowly through careful examination. The modern world rarely encourages this kind of examination. Information flows continuously, conversations move rapidly, and attention is constantly pulled in different directions. Yet the human mind still retains the capacity to step outside that flow. Even in the middle of emotional chaos, a person can choose to pause, observe, and think. When someone develops this habit, their relationship with information begins to change. Instead of reacting immediately to every story they encounter, they begin asking deeper questions. What evidence supports this claim? What information might be missing? Who benefits if I believe this interpretation? What emotional reaction is being encouraged here? These questions do not remove emotion from human life, but they prevent emotion from dominating thought. Over time, this process produces a quieter form of confidence. It is different from the loud certainty that often dominates public debate. Loud certainty declares that it already knows the answer. Quiet confidence accepts that complex issues require time and reflection. It remains open to new information and willing to revise its conclusions. This type of thinking may not attract as much attention online, but it leads to deeper understanding. Carl Jung believed that the path towards psychological maturity begins when a person becomes aware of their own unconscious reactions. Instead of projecting their fears and frustrations onto the outside world, they begin examining those emotions internally. They recognize that anger, jealousy, pride, and fear are natural parts of the human psyche. But they also recognize that these emotions should not control their perception of reality. As individuals develop this awareness, they become less predictable to systems built around emotional manipulation. Content designed to provoke outrage may no longer succeed. Narratives designed to trigger fear may no longer produce immediate compliance. The person begins responding to information thoughtfully rather than emotionally. This does not make them indifferent to injustice or suffering, but it allows them to approach problems with clarity instead of impulse. Gradually, a new perspective begins to emerge. The constant emotional noise of modern society becomes easier to recognize for what it is, a system of incentives that rewards reaction more than reflection. People begin noticing how often conversations are framed to provoke outrage rather than encourage understanding. They notice how frequently complex issues are reduced to simple emotional narratives. They notice how easily groups divide themselves into opposing camps that repeat the same arguments again and again. Once these patterns become visible, they are difficult to ignore. The individual begins seeing emotional manipulation not as a mysterious force, but as a predictable system that operates through repetition and reward. Headlines trigger fear because fear increases engagement. Posts trigger anger because anger spreads quickly. Narratives encourage tribal loyalty because loyalty keeps communities emotionally unified. Understanding this system does not require rejecting society or abandoning technology. It simply requires awareness. The person who understands emotional manipulation can still participate in conversations, read news, and use digital platforms. The difference is that they no longer surrender control of their emotional reactions to those systems. Instead of reacting automatically, they choose when to respond and when to remain silent. They choose which issues deserve serious attention and which ones are simply emotional distractions. They choose when to examine evidence carefully and when to ignore narratives designed only to provoke outrage. This ability creates a quiet form of independence. The person no longer feels compelled to join every emotional conflict that appears in the public conversation. They become more selective about where they invest their attention and energy. Their mind becomes less reactive and more reflective. Over time, this shift produces something that has become increasingly rare in modern culture: psychological stability. While others around them move rapidly between anger, excitement, fear, and outrage, the calm observer remains steady. Their emotions still exist, but they are guided rather than uncontrolled, and this stability creates a powerful form of freedom. The individual is no longer easily pushed into reaction by every emotional signal that appears in the information environment. They can observe those signals, understand their purpose, and decide how to respond consciously. In a society where emotional manipulation has become widespread, this kind of self-awareness becomes one of the most valuable abilities a person can develop. It does not make someone superior to others, but it allows them to maintain clarity in situations where confusion and emotional pressure dominate. The question that remains for every individual is simple, yet deeply important. Will you allow your emotions to be guided entirely by the environment around you? Or will you begin examining those emotions carefully before accepting them as truth? Because the future of human thought may depend less on access to information and more on the ability to remain calm and aware in a world designed to provoke constant reaction.